I'll write this as a completely new story, new protagonist, new family, new scheme, new setting while keeping the proven structural beats, the whispered warning, cold open, the profession as superpower device, the midpoint recorded confession, the secret evidence gathering montage, and critically, a courtroom ending that actually delivers real jail time to satisfy what the comments demanded. The security officer at gate 14 leaned in close, pretending to scan my boarding pass, and her voice dropped to something just above a breath. "Don't go through that door, sir. Tell them you forgot your medication in the car. Say it loud, say it now." My hand was already on the jet bridge railing. 40 feet behind me, my daughter Renee and her husband Craig stood at the window watching planes push back. The two people who had driven me to this airport, who had hugged me twice in the security line, who had told me this cruise to Alaska was exactly what I needed after losing your mother. I had 11 seconds to decide whether to trust a stranger in a blue uniform or the family I had raised with my own hands. Something in my gut, some old radar I didn't know I still had, told my mouth to open before my brain finished the sentence. I said I'd left my heart pills in the rental car. I said it loud enough for 3 people to hear, and I turned around and walked back up that jet bridge on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a claims investigator for a mid-sized insurance company outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job nobody romanticizes, until they need someone who can read a discrepancy the way other men read a box score. I spent 3 decades finding the lie hiding inside a stack of paperwork that looked perfectly honest to everyone else. I retired 4 years ago with a good pension, a paid-off house on Larkspur Lane, and a habit I never managed to break. I notice when numbers don't add up, and once I notice, I can't stop pulling the thread. I want to back up, though, because the story doesn't start at that airport. It starts 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday evening, when my daughter Renee and her husband Craig showed up at my door with a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near their eyes. My wife Diane had passed the winter before. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in September, gone by February. Fast enough that I still sometimes reached for the phone to tell her something before I remembered. Renee and Craig had been wonderful during those months, or so I told myself. They visited. They brought casseroles. Craig mowed my lawn without being asked. I chalked up the sudden closeness to grief, pulling a family together, the way it's supposed to. I didn't stop to ask why a 38-year-old man who ran a struggling used car lot suddenly had so much free time to spend at his father-in-law's house. That Tuesday, Renee sat across from me at the kitchen table where Diane used to sit, and she said, "Dad, we've been talking, and we think you need to get away. You've been so alone in this house." Craig nodded along, like a man agreeing with a script he'd rehearsed in the car. "We want to send you on a cruise, Dad," he said. "Alaska, 2 weeks. Our treat, completely paid for. You don't have to think about a single thing." I set down my coffee cup very deliberately, the same way I used to set down a claims file when a client's story had a hole in it, because I've learned that silence makes people talk. Renee filled it instantly. "It's already booked," she said. "We just need you to say yes." Already booked. Before I'd said a word, I turned that phrase over in my head like a coin with a strange weight to it, and I said, "That's generous, but a cruise is expensive. How did you two manage that on top of the lot's numbers, Craig?" And Craig's smile flickered, just for a fraction of a second, the way a bulb flickers right before it goes, and he said, "We've been saving, Walt. Don't worry about the money." Except 3 weeks earlier, over dinner, he'd told me the dealership was underwater on floor plan financing, and he was thinking about selling 2 of his personal vehicles to make payroll. Men who are drowning don't buy their father-in-law a 2-week Alaskan cruise. That night, after they left, I sat in my study, which still smelled faintly of Diane's hand cream even though she'd been gone a year, and I did what 31 years of training taught me to do with anything that didn't add up. I got out a legal pad, and I wrote down every strange thing I'd noticed in the last 2 months, Renee asking, almost too casually, whether I'd updated my will since Mom passed. Craig asking about the house, whether I'd ever consider putting both their names on the deed for tax purposes, he said, just to be safe. The new life insurance policy I'd taken out the year before, $480,000, a number Renee had commented on once at dinner, saying, "That's a lot of security, Dad," like she was tasting the words. I didn't want to believe it. I want to be honest about that because I think that's the part everyone skips over when they tell these stories after the fact. like the suspicion arrived in one clean bolt of lightning. It didn't. It arrived the way a stain spreads through fabric, slow, and I kept telling myself I was seeing patterns, because I'd spent 3 decades trained to see patterns where sometimes there were none. But then I remembered my own oldest rule from the claims department, the one I'd taught to every junior investigator who ever sat across from me. The story that requires you to ignore 3 separate facts to keep believing it is not a story, it's a con. So I ran a small test, the way I used to test a claimant's account against a timeline. At dinner, 2 nights later, I mentioned, offhand, that my doctor had found something concerning on my last EKG, a mild arrhythmia, nothing urgent, but something to watch. It was a complete fabrication. My heart, God willing, is fine. And I watched Craig's face the way I used to watch a man's face when I told him his fire claim didn't match the burn pattern in the photographs. For one unguarded half-second, something lit up behind his eyes that had no business being there. Not concern, something closer to relief, or maybe anticipation, the look of a man who has just heard that a problem might be solving itself. Then he caught himself and said, "You should get that looked at, Dad." And Renee reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "We just want you healthy for this trip." And their eyes met across the table for exactly the length of time it takes 2 people to confirm they've heard the same thing. I've cross-examined enough people to know what a shared glance looks like when it isn't affection. I packed for that trip like a man laying evidentiary groundwork, though I didn't yet know what I was gathering evidence for. I moved every prescription bottle from my checked bag into my carry-on, the kind of precaution that looks paranoid right up until it doesn't. I photographed the contents of my suitcase before I zipped it shut, a habit from a career of documenting things before they could be disturbed. On the drive to the airport, Craig's trunk was supposedly full of his golf clubs, which was why my suitcase rode on my lap in the back seat. Except I'd watched him load that trunk that morning through the kitchen window, and it had 2 golf bags and a whole lot of empty space. Renee spent the ride typing messages and deleting the threads the second she hit send, her thumb moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has done it enough times that it no longer requires thought. At the gate, they steered me through security first, Renee's hand resting on my shoulder with a firmness that had nothing to do with affection. And I noticed she watched the X-ray screen when my carry-on went through with an intensity that had nothing to do with normal boredom, and she only relaxed when the bag came out clean on the other side. "Easy, right?" she said, and her relief was sized for something much bigger than getting a suitcase through a scanner. That's when the security officer found me. Her name tag read M. Alvarez. She had the kind of face that's trained to give nothing away, professional, pleasant, unreadable, right up until she leaned close under the pretense of checking my documents, and her mouth was an inch from my ear. "Don't go through that door, sir," she said. "Tell them you forgot your medication in the car. Say it loud, say it now." Then she straightened up and became a different person entirely, waving the next passenger forward, smiling at a child, as if she'd said nothing at all. I stood there with my heart going in a way it genuinely had never gone before in my life. An irony I noted even in that moment, and 11 feet away Renee and Craig were watching the departure board, not me, and something in that fact alone told me everything I needed to know before I understood any of the details. I said the line about my medication loud enough for the gate agent and the family behind me to hear, and I turned around, and I walked back through security in the wrong direction, and a supervisor met me on the other side with a face that had already decided something was very wrong. She took me to a small office behind the ticket counter, and she checked the hallway twice before she shut the door, and she said, "What I'm about to tell you could cost me this job, but I have not been able to live with myself since my aunt died 3 years ago, and I said nothing, so I am not staying silent again." She pulled out her phone with hands that were not quite steady, and played me a video she'd recorded in the family restroom near the gate 40 minutes earlier. The angle showed ceiling tiles and fluorescent light, but the audio came through with the particular clarity that tile and porcelain give a private conversation. It was Renee's voice, and she was on speakerphone with someone I didn't recognize, and her tone was the flattest, most businesslike voice I had ever heard come out of my daughter's mouth. "He's on beta blockers already," she was saying. "If the compound interacts the way you said, it reads exactly like a cardiac event, especially at altitude, especially on a ship 3 days from the nearest real hospital." A pause, someone answering. Then Renee again, almost bored. "Craig's nervous, but he's in. 480,000. Split with you for the supply. That's the deal we agreed to." And then, the sound that I have never once been able to erase from my memory no matter how many times I've tried. My daughter laughed. I watched that recording 4 times in that little office, and each time I watched it I found a new detail to catalog, the way I used to comb a fraudulent claim for its second and third lie once I'd found the first. The specific mention of my beta blockers, medication only Renee could have known the dosage of, because she'd picked up my prescriptions for me twice that spring while I recovered from a hip procedure. The word supply, said with the same tone you'd use ordering parts for a car. The laugh. Who was she talking to, I asked, and Officer Alvarez said I don't know his name, but he called himself a consultant, and he said the timeline was solid, as long as your son-in-law didn't lose his nerve. I asked her the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Why would you risk your career for a man you've never met before today? And something old moved across her face. My Aunt Roseanne, she said. 3 years ago, she changed her will 2 weeks before she died of what the coroner called a sudden cardiac event. And the man who benefited was long gone before anyone thought to ask a single question, and I was the only one in the family who thought it was strange, and I said nothing, because what if I was wrong? What if I was the crazy one? I have carried that silence for 3 years, Mr. Pruitt. I am done carrying it. I wrote her name and her badge number into the notebook I still carry from my claims days, because 31 years of habit doesn't leave a man just because he's retired, and I asked her to send me a copy of that recording to an email address only I could access, and she did, right there, hands shaking less with every passing minute. Stop them, she said. That was the whole of her goodbye. The drive home from the airport took 40 minutes, and I spent every one of them running the numbers the way I used to run them at my old desk. $480,000. A policy I'd increased 11 months earlier at Renee's gentle suggestion. Since Mom's medical bills showed you how fast things can change, Dad, you should make sure you're covered. A cruise booked and paid for 2 weeks before they'd asked my permission. A husband drowning in dealership debt who had somehow found the money for a luxury vacation. Individually, none of it would raise an eyebrow. Together, it was the cleanest case of premeditation I had assembled in my entire career, and this time the file had my own name on it. I did not confront them that night. I want to be honest about the reason, because I think it matters. Rage would have felt better in the moment, and it would have destroyed everything. I had spent 3 decades learning that a guilty party who believes he is safe will keep generating evidence against himself, and a guilty party who feels caught will lawyer up and go silent within the hour. So instead, when Craig texted me that night, "So relieved you're okay, Dad, we were worried sick," I typed back, feeling much better, "Let's talk tomorrow about rescheduling," and I meant every word as a diagnosis, not a truce. The next 2 weeks were the strangest performance of my life, and I gave it everything a career of reading people had ever taught me. I installed a home security system, telling Renee and Craig it was for peace of mind after Mom passed, and they approved of it so warmly, so quickly, that I understood they believed cameras in the living room and kitchen would only ever show them being attentive, wonderful children, and never once did either of them think to ask about the audio or notice the small recorder I'd mounted inside an old radio on the bookshelf, the same kind of trick I'd once used, decades earlier, to catch a claims adjuster funneling payouts to a fake repair shop. It paid off within 4 days. Late one night, through my headphones in the dark of my study, I heard Craig's voice, tight and frightened. "The dealership's floor plan lender is calling every day now, Renee. If this doesn't work, I lose everything, the lot, the house, all of it." And Renee, in that same flat, clinical register I'd heard on Officer Alvarez's recording, said, "Then we go to Plan B. We tell people, Dad's been having memory problems since Mom died. Grief does strange things to a man his age. Nobody will question it. We just need a doctor willing to write it down." I lay there in the dark with my own daughter's voice in my ears, calmly discussing which lie to tell about my mind next, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the moment a solution finally, fully precipitates out after a long, slow reaction. Not rage anymore. Something colder and far more useful. I hired an attorney the following week, a woman named Carol Whitfield who had spent 22 years in elder law and had seen, she told me plainly, more of this than she wished existed. She went through Officer Alvarez's recording, the audio from my own house, and the paper trail I'd already begun pulling on my own accounts, and she said what I already suspected but needed to hear from someone else. "Walter, this isn't a family falling apart. This is a plan that's been running for months. We found the fake doctor within a week, a man operating out of a rented office suite with a printed sign taped to the door and a medical license that didn't exist in any state database. Carol checked, and I sat through his cognitive assessment, performing mild confusion the way I used to perform patience with a claimant I already knew was lying, and I recorded every word of it on a device in my shirt pocket. 2 days later, I drove myself to a real neuropsychologist, a woman with 30 years in forensic evaluation, who put me through 4 hours of testing and told me afterward, with something like admiration, that my cognitive function was sharper than most men 20 years younger, no decline whatsoever. Carol found the forged documents in the same week, a durable power of attorney granting Craig authority over my finances, my signature on it, a passable copy except for the capital W, which had a small flourish I have never once made in 68 years of signing my name. She found the transfers, $41,000, pulled from my accounts in amounts small enough that my bank's automated flags never triggered, routed into an account tied to Craig's dealership. And she found, 3 days before I would have needed it most, an email exchange between Craig and a man calling himself a wellness consultant, discussing a compound with a specific and clinical name I will not repeat here, one that stresses the cardiovascular system in a way that mimics a natural event and clears the bloodstream within hours, and a price, $18,000 for consultation and product, to be paid on delivery. Carol read it in silence and then looked up at me and said, "Walter, your son-in-law priced your death like a used transmission." I told her I'd already burned through the part of me that would have found those words unbearable 3 sleepless nights earlier, alone in my study with Diane's hand cream still faintly in the air. We built the case for 6 more weeks before we filed anything, because Carol agreed with the instinct I'd trusted my entire career. Let a guilty man keep writing his own confession. Craig's gambling debts surfaced during that time, $70,000 across 3 sports books, a detail that explained the dealership's collapse far better than bad luck did. Renee's phone, recovered later through a forensic subpoena, held 6 months of messages with the so-called consultant, discussing dosage, discussing my travel schedule, discussing, in one message that Carol read aloud in a voice gone completely flat, whether a ship's medical bay would be slow enough to matter. My own son-in-law, in an unrelated text to a friend, complained that his father-in-law wouldn't die fast enough to save the lot, a sentence that would later be read into the court record word for word. The freeze on my accounts triggered on a Tuesday morning while I sat behind a newspaper I wasn't reading, and I heard Craig's voice go sharp upstairs within the hour, calling for Renee, his calls to the bank curdling from confident to desperate, as he learned every account, with his name quietly attached, had been frozen pending a fraud review he did not yet know I had requested. That evening I cooked dinner for the 2 people who had tried to kill me, and over the meal I mentioned, conversationally, that the bank had called about some unusual activity, and I'd asked them to look into it thoroughly, and I watched my daughter's fork stop in midair for exactly 1 second before she recovered, and I understood then that some part of her had known, from that very moment, that the story was already over, even though the trial was still 4 months away. They tried one more time to have me declared incompetent, filing a guardianship petition built on the fake doctor's report and on 3 neighbors Craig had paid between $200 and $500 each to say they'd seen me wandering confused at night, testimony that fell apart within a week once Carol and I went door to door with the real evidence, and 2 of those neighbors wept with shame on their own porches when they understood what they'd actually signed their names to. The trial took place in a courtroom 40 minutes from my house, and I will tell you honestly that walking in, I did not know whether I wanted justice or something closer to revenge, and it took me until I was sitting in that gallery, watching my daughter and her husband seated at the defense table, looking smaller than I remembered them, to understand that I wanted both, and that for once in my life, those 2 things were not in conflict. The prosecutor played Officer Alvarez's recording for the jury in the 2nd week, my daughter's calm voice discussing the price of my death and then laughing, and I watched every juror's face change at once, the way a room changes temperature. Officer Alvarez testified for nearly 2 hours, and on cross-examination, when the defense attorney tried to suggest she'd fabricated the recording out of some grudge, she leaned into the microphone and said, "I have never met these people before that day. I recorded it because 3 years ago I stayed silent when something in my gut told me not to, and I have spent every day since regretting it. I was not going to make that mistake twice." I took the stand on the 9th day. The prosecutor asked me when I first knew something was wrong, and I told her the truth, that 31 years investigating insurance fraud teaches you to notice the file that requires you to ignore 3 facts to keep believing it, and that a paid vacation appearing 8 months after my wife's death, with the tickets already booked before anyone asked my permission, was exactly that kind of file. I told the jury I had spent my whole career finding the lie hiding behind a policy that looked honest on its surface, and that I never once imagined I would need those same skills to survive my own family. The jury returned after 6 hours. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of forgery, guilty of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a specific statute that exists in Ohio precisely for cases like mine, and one that Carol had made certain the prosecutor charged from the very beginning. Craig's hands were shaking so badly by the 4th guilty verdict that he had to be steadied by his own attorney. Renee did not cry until the very last count was read, and then it was a single tear, wiped away fast, as if she still believed composure might still save something. At sentencing, the judge did not hand down probation, and I want to say clearly that this is the part of the story I sat with longest before deciding to tell it, because I know how many people have heard stories like this one end with a slap on the wrist that made the whole account feel like it hadn't mattered. That is not what happened here. Craig was sentenced to 14 years for conspiracy and attempted murder, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 85% of that term under Ohio law. Renee received 16 years, the judge citing her direct role in procuring the substance and her documented, recorded laughter as an aggravating factor that showed, in the judge's own words, a complete absence of remorse at the moment the crime was being planned. Both of them were ordered to pay full restitution, and every dollar of that $480,000 policy was formally stripped from their reach for the rest of their natural lives. The judge, before adjourning, looked directly at the defense table and said something I wrote down in my notebook that night and have read more than once since. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a business plan built around a man's death, and the only reason he is alive to see this verdict is a stranger who refused to look away. Your victim's trust is the only thing in this courtroom that cannot be returned to you. I was given the chance to speak before sentencing, and I kept it short, because 31 years of writing claims, reports taught me that the shortest true sentence is always the one people remember. I told them I did not hate them. I told them I grieved them, the same way I would grieve a fire that took a house I'd lived in my whole life. I told them that I had spent my whole career finding the lie underneath a story that looked honest, and that the hardest file I ever had to open was the one with my own family's name on it, and that I closed it the only way I knew how, by telling the truth, completely, all the way to the end. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane. I still keep Diane's hand cream on the dresser, because some habits you don't have the heart to break. Officer Alvarez and I still talk every few months, and I was there in the gallery, this past spring, when she testified again, this time for her late aunt's case, which finally reopened because a detective who'd heard about my trial decided her instincts back then had been worth a second look after all. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I think it's the only part of this that matters once the courtroom empties out. Being loved and being trusted are not the same thing, and I spent 68 years assuming they were. If you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. Call your insurance company this week and ask them to read your current beneficiaries back to you out loud, and then ask them to flag your policy so no change can be made without your direct verbal confirmation. It takes 10 minutes. Most people haven't checked in a decade, and the people closest to you may already know that. And if you've ever caught one wrong flash in a familiar face, a look that didn't match the moment, tell me about it, because I promise you, you did not imagine it. Put a 1 in the comments if you think I was right to stay quiet and build the case in silence for 6 weeks instead of calling the police that same afternoon. Put a 2 if you think I should have confronted Craig and Renee face to face before the law ever got involved. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are, because these stories travel further than I ever expected, and it means something every single time I hear from one of you. If tonight's story meant something to you, stay a while and subscribe, because I have a lifetime of these, and I'll see you in the next one.